Thank you all for being here bright and early after a great party last night. Thank you to the Volkswagen Foundation and of course to Christian, a great colleague and friend and mentor in many ways. It was very generous of him to give me this place of a keynote in a room full of experts. No pressure. Okay, so I started a lab at MIT called the Urban Risk Lab. We're an interdisciplinary lab of architects, landscape architects, urbanists, software engineers, geoinformatics specialists, ethnographers, and planners. And as Christian mentioned, our focus is on preparing cities for earthquakes and flooding, but trying to embrace the MIT way. So after I moved there, there was some hesitation to all the technology and innovation around me, but I took my time to figure out how and when I want to access that and work with it. Yeah, and so the earthquakes and flooding, I'm half Japanese and half Dutch, and so somehow by DNA I must work in disaster preparedness. I escaped for a little while to a Office of Metropolitan Architecture, but quickly I found myself coming back to work in this. We really focus on action research. We want to have the research in the lab be applied in the field, and so hopefully I will be able to share some of those projects with you. Our two main goals, connecting everyday needs to post-disaster needs. We find that very few organizations are willing to invest in the if-then for later, but if you're able to connect that with needs that a group has today, then it's more seamless. We also want to connect citizens' efforts. There's tremendous amount of work done at the ground level, which we heard a lot about in the last 2 days, with government efforts, which we also heard about, and how do you connect that? So we work in a range of different kinds of scales and also different types of projects, from really designing prototypes and products all the way to software platforms and larger systems. So as Christian mentioned, we had the opportunity to work together in Haiti with Michelle Matera, who spoke yesterday, as well as Phil Thompson, who is here as well. So we had a little reunion. As much as I'd like to show this project, because it's one of my favorites, really treating the matter in a holistic way, but it'll take the whole hour, and you might have heard about it from Christian already. I do want to share this one quote. So this quote that comes from that project is by Eric de Ofterheide, who is a trauma surgeon. It's more effective to learn what people tend to do naturally in disasters and plan around that than to design a plan and expect people to conform. This is something which, from that project, we have lived with in our lab and tried to embrace in all of our projects. So today I'd like to share 3 projects. First is the real-time flood mapping, and then a sea level rise platform, as well as emergency preparedness platform. So we heard from Fernando yesterday about how social media can be a surprising help. We also heard from Torsten, I saw him somewhere, about how to reach information to the last mile. And this project is really trying to do both of those things, but in dual directions. So alerting residents, but also collecting information from them. So how can we make this a dialogue between residents and government instead of a more top-down nature? So we've been working on deploying this in many different places and really learning from the research in each one of these contexts. And so it's live in India and the US and in Indonesia, and we have a large team. And as a designer, this page makes me cringe, but I found out the hard way that sponsors get really angry if you make their logo black and white. So here they all are, supported by USAID, the Tata Center at MIT and Broward County, project partners of the Pacific Disaster Center, OpenStreetMaps team, and a community civic action group in India, as well as governments and data partners. The 2 questions, research questions we try to ask are, how can we use participatory data collecting to really process and enhance a city's resilience during disasters? And how can we cut down on the response time? using real-time reporting. So we heard a lot of frightening statistics yesterday, and this is just adding to it. Approximately 21 million people worldwide are affected by river floods each year, and that would increase to 54 million by 2030, based on climate change, again, conversations we had yesterday. The impact of these disasters will get more severe, and here are the current populations that are exposed to risk, a lot of them in Asia, India and Indonesia, the two of the ones that we're working in at the moment. So we created this platform, and I have to emphasize over and over, it is not an app. There's a lot of research out there that shows that people do not download these emergency apps unless you are an emergency fanatic, like me, but even still, I don't have all of them, or unless it's happening, and at that time that it's happening, it is not the right time to be downloading an app. So this is a platform which again tries to connect the people's everyday into the at the time of the disaster. So what does it do? Currently, when there's flood advisory reports, they're usually over a vast amount of area. This is one for Florida. This is half of Broward County, basically. It's flooding, beware. And this media logos of this flooding doesn't really give you specific information when they say use caution, right? But there is a lot of information out there. It's just harder to digest for the general public. For example, this is flood gauge data, heights, in real time from Fort Lauderdale. What if you could just click on the well next to your home and see what level it's on and whether the water level is going up or down? Now you might say, okay, this is Florida, it doesn't pertain to the kind of work that we're doing elsewhere in the world, but this project actually originated in Jakarta with Etienne and Thomas, who are still part of the team, and running the project in these places. And you would be surprised actually how much data is collected by international organizations and cities that are never shown in a very easily accessible way to the public, to help the public prepare themselves. So what this does is you can see most of these gauges are in green, but there's an orange one. If you click on the orange one, you can see that the water level's going up, but it's not bright red yet. I checked this morning, the gauges are down in Indonesia, so even if you check real time, they're not up right now, but you will see them up in the future. The other part of the platform collects information from journalists. So for example, in Jakarta, when journalists tweet on their app, when journalists post on their app, that information, when it pertains to flooding, comes directly to our platform. And the other thing it does, which I briefly mentioned already, is collects information from people. So Twitter, Facebook, there's two ways in Twitter. One is that if we hear you saying #flood, which in Bahasa is #banjir, then we will send you a little report. Would you like to post? If you happen to be talking about bathrooms flooding or something else, you'll ignore our little message. But if you want to report, then you're given a link that takes you to these very, very simple cards. And again, we designed them very carefully to make sure that they are really easily accessible and really easy to report. The precise centimeter isn't necessary in this case. Add a photo for verification, and then also add some text. And then we ask you to swipe, we send you a thank you for your report, and then you're immediately taken to the page. So this makes it transparent. You're not sending information to a government black box and not knowing what happens with the information. You are able to share this directly through your social media to your friends. So again, this is taking, people are sharing this information with their friends already and just adding one little step within the same platform, not taking you to another platform, within the same platform to report a flood. And then people are informing people. And a lot of times they really embrace it and add their own heartfelt icons and things to it. So this version of this platform was launched last January. And then in February, there was enormous flood in Jakarta, and we had a lot of people looking at our website within 24 hours. And even Uber drivers were using it to say, these are the parts of the city we will navigate in, and here's the parts that we won't. So hundreds of thousands of people were looking at this and posting. What we are done in Jakarta is worked very closely with the emergency managers there. So they have this platform, and then they have a risk evaluation matrix on their end that we custom built, which then categorizes the information, and then they're able to make these verified reports on certain districts, right? And this follows their system of categorizing whether it's a low-level risk or a high-level risk, and that triggers their response systems. And so this happens much more quickly now. And what's interesting about this is that now we're collecting ground-level data, really at like intersection of roads, to city level with the districts, but then taking it out to a regional scale. So one of our partners on this project, which I mentioned briefly, is the Pacific Disaster Center at the University of Hawaii. And it's supported by USAID, and they have this large agency platform called InAware, which takes information like the early warning systems that Torsten was talking about, and emergency managers gets alerts from this system. Now, so this whole stack is connected now with the ground level data all the way up to this regional data within these platforms. So we've been working hard to figure out how to scale this project. And each place we go, we learn a lot from reconceptualizing the project into new contexts. It's not just a copy and paste. So we come to India, and a lot has been discussed about the floods in this conference, and we learned a lot about the better way to mitigate from Mr. Singh day before yesterday. But what about places which are already fully built out? And especially in places like Chennai, rapid urbanization is really a beast. There we went after the floods and talked to the emergency managers about how they cope with it. And everything is paper-based, phone calls, people typing into a database after paper-based information submitted or a phone call is submitted. And then on the other side, there were thousands of people who were tweeting and texting information, but it was all in the scrolling type of information where you have to use a lot of either machine learning or human effort to collect this information and organize it. And so again, what we're trying to do in this project is people as sensors. So what do we do if we move to the next country? First, of course, there are language issues, and so we created the platform both in English and in Tamil there. And we were watching the rain events in Chennai, and Aditya Barve from our lab, who's running the India project, noted that there was a big rain event coming. So we hadn't officially launched yet, but we launched anyway. And this was with our partners, our NGO partners, the Civic Action Group. And between November 2nd and 3rd, within those 24 hours, the city received 160 millimeters of rain, which was the highest since the 2015 floods. And lots of really great reports of people informing people that people are moving out because they're scared that water levels might increase. This area is fully inundated. And also things like there's an open manhole, proceed with caution, right? Very important information to have at this time. So we received about 76,000 reports, and that's without a full launch. Like this was a very ad hoc, let's do it, rains are coming, we need to set this to go. And as people were getting ready to go to work or to school, we actually had 1,000 views of the website per second. We were a bit shocked about this. So now that this is over, we're going back through and we're talking to the government and we're trying to figure out what are the mechanisms to keep this going there and how to scale it within the city and inform more people about the reporting mechanisms. What was interesting in the early conversations in Chennai was that the government asked us to also prepare preparedness cards. So as the monsoon season's coming, how can people report, oh, this drain is blocked. Please take a look at this and fix this. So we loved this idea, which actually came from the government officials, where people become stewards of their city. They become much more aware that there is a monsoon coming, that they can be responsible, and they can help and change the city around them. With Broward County, we've also been talking about what to do during a hurricane, the different types of damages that come out, whether it could be helpful to indicate which emergency shelters are open and have capacity. There are many different ways that, as I was saying, we move to a different context. We try to evolve and change and adapt to that context and develop new cards. So the cards themselves are technically rather agnostic. So we can develop cards about any type of issue, really. And so it's really the human interface that's the part that takes a lot of effort and connection. So that's that project, where we really try to reduce the risk together, both with government and citizens. We talked a lot about sea level rise yesterday and climate change. This will be rather brief because I'm giving you a snapshot into a project that's not officially launched yet, but we've been working on it for a while with Broward County. And it's in collaboration with the University of Toronto, with Fadi Massoud, who is assistant professor there in landscape architecture. There are a lot of platforms out there that show the effects of climate change and the visualizing entire cities going blue. So we didn't want to do that. But we wanted to work with Broward County to really figure out, so what are the mechanisms, right? We talked about fight or flight yesterday. What are the mechanisms to start talking to people without scaring them, but having them be aware of there needs to be something that they start saving for or preparing for. So in the same way that as a homeowner you would know in about 30 years you need to replace your roof, we want people to really ingest this, even on a personal scale. And so what we're trying to do with this platform is link all of that hazard data down to the homeowner's plot scale with types of, they're not recommendations from us, but in collaboration with the local government, what the recommendations are. So again, this platform shows you hazard areas, flood areas, but also really easily allows you to couple it with things like stormwater drainage systems, which ones are built a long time ago. And in Florida, along with a lot of other places, there is saltwater intrusion. So those drains are starting to fall apart. Now, a lot of people will ask us, well, this seems like GIS. So GIS is great. We all use GIS, but GIS is expensive. There's a very steep learning curve. You really need a good computer that can process it because of the weight of the data. And some cities, even in Florida, can't afford a GIS specialist in-house. And so they note everything on paper, and then once a year they send it out. So that's in Florida. You can imagine how GIS experts and this data processing, maybe in this new generation we can also find other ways to complement this, right? And so it's not saying we're trying to replace. There's no way to actually replace the Esri platform, but complement it. So this platform, as you can see, really does things and processes them quickly, and it's online. And so any person in a neighborhood can go click on their single-family home and get information about their flood levels, the Broward County's new plan for 2065 and how they fit in with their new zoning plans. The other thing is that, so this is a graph that was put out by Broward County. And Broward County has invested a lot of information in the 2065 water table heights, but it comes in this graph, right? Again, not that easy for you, me, regular people to understand how that connects with the site. So what the platform does is also take this information, which they spent a lot of money gathering and modeling this information, and then allows you to click on certain places, and this is the sea level rise, and then that's the projected, right? And so what it does also is if you're planning a retention pond, you don't want to make it there. You'd want to make it somewhere where the groundwater won't be coming up within that time frame. So making decisions about investments. Again, we don't want you to have to move to another platform. We want you to be able to click, and then from that click, immediately go to the types of recommendations that the city is suggesting. So this is my last project. I don't know where time is, but okay. It's also a rather extensive project. We've tried to scale it in many different contexts. We call this the Emergency Preparedness Hub, and for short, Prep Hub. Again, many partners. This particular version of it is with Portland, Oregon, the Bureau of Emergency Management, the City Planning Department, the Oregon Solar Trust, Portland Electric, and then, Portland State University, and again, a large team. So what this really thinks about is, in Portland, they're preparing for the Cascadia earthquake event. And in the general context, it's really promoted to have individual preparedness, right? But all of these things are expensive. What about people who can't afford to buy a generator? And what about community preparedness? So we are really trying to develop these types of iconic structures that we call prep hubs as a new type of infrastructure to increase disaster resilience. By activating neighborhood spaces on an everyday, like a park or a plaza that's not used very often, this will be a way to make fun activities for that space while secretly embedding a lot of disaster preparedness within it, so that they become a resource during an emergency. So what happens during that emergency? We've looked and studied quite a bit about the first 72 hours or longer where there may not be support that comes in. This is an image after Sandy where there's important information, but it's posted at this very ad hoc way. It's just on a whiteboard. There is power to be shared, but again, very ad hoc. We also, in earthquake areas, want people to have a connection of where their closest safe outdoor space is. So this is an image from Nepal after the Kathmandu earthquake. We want people to have a mental map of their city, of where these safe spaces are. So this is one scale of the project. It's something that you can really put in a sidewalk or a small triangular plaza that's very difficult to design and use effectively. And this is one example that we've prototyped and built, where there's a solar panel which trickle charges. There is a camera, there is an information screen display, a sound speaker, a unique identification code, and as well as power charging and emergency lighting. This whole thing can operate for 3 days after an earthquake, even if the systems go offline. So this is the interaction. You see this mother with her phone encouraging her son to charge. People ask, why don't you have a larger solar panel? Why do people have to come and pedal? Well, it's really because of this. Like, we want that curiosity to be there. If it's a box in a park that's beige, how many people will notice it or remember it when they're in a panic after a disaster? But if your kids went there and biked on it, or if you went there to get some exercise to charge your phone, then you're much more likely to remember. Every part of this project we try to design with this dual focus that I've been talking about, every day and post-disaster. So this is one example out of many, but charging your phone. So these lights turn on one at a time as you're pedaling, and then when you reach a 5% charge, you get a rainbow. Now, kids love this because, of course, they're racing each other. We have some of these prep hubs that have 2 chargers on 2 sides, and they're filling the battery for all the people who do not want to bike, like me. What this does in an emergency event is it shows you that you have 5% charge, and if there are 100 people waiting in line, they also can see that you have a 5% charge, which is enough to make your emergency phone calls. So it's a polite way to ask you to step off and let somebody else on. There are other components of this, like the QR code brings you to a map. In Portland, Oregon, we've been discussing with them how that can represent local small businesses and restaurants and things, whereas after a disaster, it can then show you where your closest emergency evacuation station is. Of course, the lighting of it will change too, depending on what the current scenario is. So Portland, Oregon has been a great partner for us because they actually have already allocated where the 49 safe spaces are, and they call them beacon sites. And they're mainly school playgrounds, the larger fields, and the public parks. What's interesting about the way they located this, and we don't take any credit, this is what they've done already, is they've co-located them with a fire station. So as a redundancy plan, if all the networks fail, there's still a radio connection that can be made from the trained radio ham radar operators to these sites, and then the speaker on our system would help to broadcast it. So Coco talked about contingencies, but really trying to work contingencies even into these very small infrastructure prototype deployments. What we're trying to do with the project is treat it modularly, that we don't want it to become the light post that we sell to thousands of cities, right? That's not our intent here. We're still based in research, and we're still very interested in the human connection. So our idea with this is that it would be able to accommodate, as a modular way, many different kinds of things, including water tanks, and including sanitation, which we've made small models of, but no one will fund us at this point in time to make a full prototype of. But it's very important to consider sanitation. In the same way, we're thinking of the electronics inside and the software system as a modular system. So this is a comparison between a centralized system and also a distributed network. So how we work through these projects. I mentioned how it is really important for us to connect with the people. And so we do a lot of community workshops. This is one in San Francisco with the Neighborhood Empowerment Network. And really get people to pinpoint where their home is located in relationship to the neighbors. So where is Mrs. So-and-so who might be 85 years old, and how can I help in these situations? And then we do the prototyping in-house, again, testing it with students, testing it on campus, testing it with many different age groups, and then we take it out to the streets. So this is a test that we did in San Francisco. And one is to see how it holds up. We learned a lot from this. And then also how, when you leave it overnight, what happens to it when it's left overnight on a busy street in San Francisco. Lots of failed attempts and learning. It's a long learning process. But we also do surveys. The ethnographer on our team helps us to create surveys so that each component within it we're able to test. What we want to do with this modular system is through this community engagement and survey process to really think about, well, maybe we only want one, or maybe we want another module. And originally we had this very optimistic view of the project where every single one can be shaped differently. And we can work with artists, and we can work with different community members to make everyone distinct. But the fabrication restrictions and then the software and the electronics actually make that very expensive for each one. So we're trying to balance between scaling and individuality. And this is one way. The tower shape can change, but the size can change. Another way is to get the community input before they're put into the areas. So in the same way that the Portland emergency management team has trained neighborhood emergency managers to come to their meetings, we want community groups, as well as the trained emergency managers, to participate in what this should look like. So we've been working on this, we're moving from material from a HDPE material to steel, and we're working on how to perforate it with different types of icons and patterns. So they can have a conversation about, well, in this neighborhood, they want to have an icon, or they want to, this is located in a school, so the school has a competition, and the winner, the child, whatever they design, goes onto the Prep Hub as a logo of that place. And so we want each one to be unique, but still be able to scale the system. So the first Portland version will be similar to this in size, but as I mentioned, with different materials and different patterns. And the different patterns really bring that conversation with the community to have them. We want people to love these projects, not be, oh, the government stuck in this thing and now we have to deal with it. But we want some kind of ownership. So it's important to have these community design workshops that we all participate in. The last part of this presentation that I want to share is also connected to this project. I talked about the ambition about having different modules, one of them being water. So for this project, we had the opportunity to go to Nepal after the earthquake. Through the research initiative and grant supporting system of the Tata Center, it really encourages students and faculty to spend a lot of time in country and supports that. And so Hugh McGee was able to spend many months there, both during summers and in January, to talk to different communities, to understand what are the real issues right after the earthquake, and also explain the types of projects that we're working on. And it came back to us over and over that it was really water, right? And not only that, water is also an issue on the everyday basis. That there's some women who spend 4 hours a day looking for potable water. So this is on a much smaller scale than what Kate was talking about yesterday, but it's a small scale pilot project, also trying to make women's lives easier and empower the women in this project. So as I mentioned, we had the opportunity to go at the end of the summer. We're always careful to go once the emergency phase has completed, because we don't want to take any resources away as researchers, and so we're really careful about when we do go to these disaster sites. And then spend time both understanding the culture and the everyday and the history of the place, as well as the post-disaster effects. So as I mentioned, Hugh spent a lot of time there, and he reported back about these patis. Now they're these small pavilions that are in the Kathmandu Valley that have existed for a very long time, and they've already embodied this social aspect of a place, a generous place for traders who are traveling through the mountains to be able to stop and rest. And their community was always providing some water at each one of these places. And he wrote back, and we talked, and then we really fell in love with these patis. And there are hundreds of them throughout the Kathmandu Valley. And they really are already these social collection points. So in Portland, Oregon, we have to make it on a map and very clear, these are your social points to go to. Here, we found that these already exist. And they really, when you start mapping them, they exist on every little street corner. And from there, we talked to a number of different organizations and went to a number of different small towns and focused in on Techo. And I forgot to mention in the first slide, but we're working very closely with the Mahila Women's Trust. And so they are a cooperative within Techo that is all women, and they microfinance a lot of the projects within Techo. We're working with Lumanti, which is an NGO that has been working extensively after the earthquake, a lot in building houses and infrastructure. And we're working with ENFO, which is a water and sanitation NGO. So those are our partners there. And this little red piece here is our site. And here we are starting to have these conversations with both the water engineers and members of the community of what needs to go into this. So we also had to look quite a bit into the water collection system. We tested wells and springs to understand what type of contaminants were mostly prominent. Did all the testing for them to really get an understanding of what issues we're trying to solve. Mapping the water table. So this is a water table survey, and then also a survey of the public taps. What are the issues around the public taps? So the public taps, the municipal taps, only run for about 20 minutes each day. And it's when Mr. Municipal Public Tap person comes along and turns on the valve in the main road. And people are waiting, and when someone says, water's running, they all run to then collect that water. But that's not a good use of anyone's time. So these surveys were really to understand what are the household needs, what are the ideal needs, how much water we should really be aiming to collect here. And then we did detailed drawings of the existing pati. And this was interesting for us too, where we couldn't get maps, right? And so we really measured the space. And that brought a different level of understanding to the design of it as well. And currently what's happening is their work has been started on a well. We moved the sanitation line that was actually contaminating the spot where people were collecting water. So we moved that line, and we dug a well, and the community has contributed so much in terms of labor for the project and also guiding the selection of the construction teams. We're working also on guidelines for you don't want to have your washing station at the same place as your drinking water collection system, but how you can design these micro spaces to be small but separate. We're also thinking a lot about how to scale this to different places, so that really thinking about the whole prep hub collection of systems, a different place in the Kathmandu Valley might have a different application to the pati. We've also been in conversation, so the building behind the pati was demolished after we got there because there was a lot of seismic damage. So in our kind of zealousness to design the whole space, we also have been talking to both the Women's Cooperative and the Guti and Lumanti about this larger project of really collecting rainwater. And so this is showing the Guti building behind and how a proposal for a larger rainwater collection system might be. And again, this is really trying to connect the everyday needs and use of water. They were using the building in the back as a place to cook food and distribute food. And so again, how they can use that as that space for the everyday, but then in an emergency, it provides a place where people can go for water and also as an emergency evacuation area. So in all of these projects, we try to brainstorm about the everyday scenarios as well as the emergency scenarios. So I know that we want to save a substantial amount of time for conversation and questions. I want to pose two questions that we are always asking ourselves within the lab of how can we use and invent technology when appropriate, without losing the connections to real people and real needs. And the other is, how can we scale without losing specificity? So I want to leave you with that, and hope we can have a discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Mio, for the very nuanced talk, for the many different impulses that we got through that talk, the very different projects. And we open it up to the audience and see, maybe collect 3 questions again. So there are 1, 2, 3 all on this side. That's interesting.
Yes. Okay. Good morning.
Morning.
I'm very interested with your apps, actually, and I recognize it's a bit more to the post-disaster apps, and so do you know that you can explore more through that apps, because I recognize that there is a special group in, we call it a WhatsApp group. It's in the local sectors that consists of more that related stakeholders to disaster, like for example the disaster agencies, also with the public agencies, and so they can monitor, like for example, if there is a flood in the upstream, they will inform that events through the WhatsApp group, and they will rather disseminate the information, so the people from the downstream, they can prepare for the floods. That's the and before the media knows, that group already knows that event. So probably it's a suggestion for you that you can also include these stakeholders. And the second is that since it's a post-disaster apps, do you also integrate the public facilities that, because, for example, if the floods happen, people probably want to know where is the available hospitals, or which airport is closed. Like, for example, just recently this night, there's an floods events, it's a heavy floods in Jogja, but I already see in your map, you haven't include Jogja in your maps. Yeah, that's right. And so 7 people has gone. They're missing. And also 2 days ago there is a volcanic eruption in Bali, and it caused the airport there was closed. So probably how do you integrate this event to probably to inform the user that, okay, so the airport is closed, I have to use the bus or probably the train or whatever. Do you already explore that, or just that one? Thank you.
Can I answer?
Wanna do it?
Well, it's just, that's a lot. So, sorry. Or maybe I need to take notes. No, I think it's great, and it's exactly what we want to work in Jogja. I have university contacts there, but if you have additional contacts in the government, please let me know. We can talk after. I'm based in Singapore right now at SUTD, the Singapore University of Technology and Design, and so and we were actually supposed to go on a community service trip to Bali, and so we have been monitoring what is happening in Bali quite carefully. And I didn't mention the alerts, because so this page, as well as the alerts, is the next phase of what we're really trying to work on. The alerts, what we're trying to do is, once you've reported, within that thank you that you get back, we want to be able to say, please, if you are interested in receiving a report, an alert, please let us know 3 locations. So you could say, for example, your school or your home or important places. We don't want to spam people, and we're not the government, but we want to make sure that if you subscribe to it, then you're able to receive the alert. That is something that we're working on. And then this image, so I didn't explain it very carefully, but this is trying to find where the emergency shelters are, because even in Florida, they have a hard time tracking how many people are in them. And there's a lot of time wasted going to one, realizing it's full, going to another one. There are also many special needs, right? So there's some that really cater and are much more accessible to all populations. And then there are some that allow you to bring pets and some that don't. And so there are a lot of different differentiations within the emergency evacuation centers too. What's Up? We have been trying so hard to work with What's Up. So again, if you have connections, please let me know. I think, so from some of the field work I did in Malaysia, it's amazing how, like you say, there's this whole group of people who are connected, and even in very, very remote places, right? The village head will have everyone's phone number, and boom, that's how the information gets spread. And so we want to work with a What's Up, and if you have, any of you have connections, please let us know. We are working with Facebook, and Facebook bought What's Up, but somehow there still isn't that mechanism, because I've heard that we haven't been able to approach What's Up. But thank you. Yes.
Well, thank you very much for this inspiring talk, and especially regarding the already asked question, I want to draw maybe some attention to the fact that crowdsourcing information regarding new technologies and media, of course, relies on an infrastructure that does not break down in an emergency case. So, especially from Indonesia, we got the experience that during an earthquake or, say, during a flood, that the power cut, there will be power cuts, or even the communication towers will fail. So that I like to ask the redundancy of your system. It's fancy, it works nice in nice weather conditions, but what can we do about the redundancy to have a sort of a second edition, or say some point? And regarding the second question, how can we scale up? I think that is a very important question, and from our experience, I think one major aspect is the implementation of systems we are developing and we are producing. Well, in the end of the day, the donor funds will come to an end, and then you have to disappear from the country. And so you need to have an entity, an authority that keeps the spirit, the system alive, maintain it and operate it. Mm-hmm. So the question is, do we always have in mind to implement our systems in scaling systems up and to have it alive after 5 years as well?
Just sort of a related question to the previous question, which is, in the U.S., the proliferation of smartphones is pretty ubiquitous at this point. But in Nepal or in Indonesia, I presume that cell phone proliferation is quite widespread, but not so much smartphones. And so I'd be interested to hear your thoughts on how to extend these kinds of platforms to reach folks who don't have smartphones, mm-hmm. both for the sort of receiving information and for contributing. Mm-hmm.
Miho, thank you so much for this inspiring presentation. One thing that struck me as you were actually showing these modules was you seem to be combining a meeting space, a real live physical meeting space in communities, as well as the potential for these technological connections. What thoughts have you and your team had about that combination of community meeting space, which seems to be really important in all situations, but maybe especially in emergency situations, and the technological links? In some ways, it's kind of similar to the WhatsApp question, and a little bit similar to the availability of technology. I'd be interested what experiences you've had or any thoughts you're thinking for the future. Thanks.
Thanks for all the questions. Let me go backwards. Starting with Coco's question. With the Prep Hub project, I think the main focus is that meeting space. And we feel that if we are able to have people know where they have to go to be safe, we've done our job. So that is really the main focus. The technological in the US, it is a way to bring people to notice it and to engage in it. And then in Nepal, it's to emphasize something that already exists. And so the reason I really am interested in both of those projects equally is that in Nepal we've found systems like biosand filtration that uses very little maintenance and trying to find methods that improve the situation but without overburdening the system. And then in the US, trying to find, again, ways to get people to the space, to interact with it, to remember it, but then having those redundancy plans in place when systems fail. From that to jump to your question about failing systems, in my ideal world, there would be prep hubs and our platform everywhere. The prep hubs can generate electricity, and anyway. So my ideal world is a dream, but we are very conscious of both the digital gap that Zach was asking about, as well. In Indonesia, actually, in Jakarta, there are more smartphones than there are in my neighborhood, and a lot of people have 2, right? So it's incredible there. But in Chennai, there are pockets of the city that don't have them. But I think that the scaling of that is happening way quicker than we even imagine. In Chennai, our conversations with the government is currently they have a call-in, a landline, so that we're trying to figure out the way to automate that landline call-in information onto the map as well. Currently, there is somebody who takes the call and then types it into the Excel sheet, and we're trying to figure out what the best way is. But it is complicated to understand the way people report, whether it's an intersection or an address, and so that's something we're trying to grapple with right now. But really, the goal is to have both of these systems in play, and that's to answer also the what if the energy grid fails? Yeah, so I think though that, so this is the thing with technology too, is I feel like there are many caveats that it's not a perfect system in so many cases, but it's not a reason to ignore it or to not do it or not try. And so really trying to find that right balance through these projects.
Yeah, actually it's related to this, to the question about what I would call the vulnerable groups in cities. And I'm wondering if in the maps, you actually, after you receive a lot of hints and people are, do you have areas where there is no information at all? And that does relate to those areas where socioeconomical data show that is below the average? And the other question would be, did you have analyzed not only the access to the technology, but the ways they use the technology? Because for instance, in the case I'm working in Acapulco, and the way middle upper class uses social networks are completely, I mean, it's not completely different, but they are the main difference with people that are in low-income neighborhood in the periphery. So I was wondering if you analyze that, and if that inform also how you are developing the platform.
So I think my answer is a little bit similar to the answer that I gave previously about the technological divide that some people call it. But there are pockets of Chennai that we're very aware of that need for us to make this landline connection part of the project work. So that now, currently they have this call-in number, and that's how they communicate with the government, and that we need to make that part be live on the map also. So we're very aware of that, and it's interesting for me to have these conversations with people like you to understand what are the other case scenarios in different cities and how we need to think about these. And hopefully we'll have the opportunity to scale to these different places and tackle each one of those problems one by one. The data analysis is something that we are, so there's the before and the after, right? The data analysis of the population beforehand, and then also the data analysis of what comes in. And we're still working with both of those sets. This current event in Chennai just happened in November, and so we haven't had time to digest it all. It was also, as I mentioned, sort of a pre-launch, and so we can't consider it a data set in terms of academic research ways, because we know that we did not do the full extent of outreach and stakeholder engagement in order to get people to report. And so we don't consider that an actual data set yet, but more of a pre-pilot launch to just get it tested and out there. But so I think for us, the sort of scaling question is, as we learn from these different cities and people working in them, how can we keep improving this so that it does actually capture a majority of the population? And if it's not smartphone, then what are the other mechanisms to make sure that the alerts go in, whether it's calling by phone or we saw yesterday the emergency flag, right? Like, how else do we need to incorporate as much information as possible into this platform?
All right.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you very much, Miho, for that.